Hello, hello, hello. Welcome and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am going to be starting a series where I talk about IFRS 15 revenue. So IFRS 15 is quite a big standard to unpack. So what I'd like to do over the course of this series is go through sort of the key features of IFRS 15 while looking at the illustrative examples to IFRS 15 or adapting them slightly so that we can see how these principles in IFRS 15 are actually applied in the real world. So in this video, I'm going to start off with the first part of the 5-step revenue recognition process. But before I get into the content, let's just familiarize ourselves, or at least remind ourselves with what the objective of IFRS 15. The core principle in IFRS 15 is that an entity is going to recognize revenue to depict the transfer of promised goods and services to customers in an amount that reflects the consideration to which that entity expects to be entitled to in exchange for those goods or services. So that's the main objective / principle within IFRS 15. Now, the way that the standard goes about achieving this objective is to outline 5 steps that an entity is going to apply in recognizing revenue. So the first step is that the entity needs to identify the contract with the customer. Of course, the standard is called revenue from contracts with customers, so it's very important that there is a contract that we are able to identify. So that's the first step. And this step is what we will be discussing in this video in a bit more detail. The second step is that once we have the contract, we need to identify the performance obligations embodied in that contract. And that is basically saying, what are the parties to the contract meant to do? And once we have the performance obligations, we also have to then determine the transaction price, right? So what are the goods or the services being sold for? Okay, and then once we have the transaction price, we have to then allocate the transaction price to the different performance obligations within the contract. And once we've done that, step 5 is to then recognize the revenue from the different performance obligations as the entity satisfies those performance obligations. So that's the 5-step process for recognizing revenue. So let's get into step 1 and understand that step or that part a bit better. Now let's talk about identifying the contract with the customer. Okay, so in IFRS 15, when we talk about identifying the contract with the customer, there are 5 things that or 5 criteria that we need to satisfy. Now this 5 is different from the 5 steps, okay? So forget about the 5 steps for now. We're in step 1 of the 5 steps, and now step 1 has 5 things to consider. Okay, so what are those 5 things? The first thing is that the contract must be approved by both parties, and both parties must be committed to perform in terms of the contract. So the entity is going to provide services, and the customer has an obligation to pay, and both of them agree and they are committed to perform in terms of the agreement. So that's the first thing you need. The next thing is that each party's rights are able to be identified in the contract, right? So it specifically says that the entity will provide services and the customer is going to pay X amount for those services. The third one is that a payment can be identified. So the payment in the contract, you are able to see this is what the services or the goods are being sold for. The fourth part is that the contract must have commercial substance. Okay, so when we talk about commercial substance means that the entity's future cash flows are going to be changed as a result of this transaction. right? So if we have a contract which does not have an impact on the entity's future cash flows, it's not going to change it, then we would say that that contract does not have commercial substance. So that's a really important aspect to having a contract that we are able to recognize revenue from. And then the fifth part, and this is the trickiest part, right, where we need to think about it. Okay, so the fifth part deals with the probability of an entity being able to collect the consideration. Okay, so I'm going to read specifically what it says in the standard. Okay, so in the standard it says that, okay, it must be probable that the entity will collect the consideration to which it will be entitled in exchange for goods or services that will be transferred to the customer. Now, when we evaluate this collectability of the amount, right, the entity is meant to consider only the customer's ability and intention to pay the amount of consideration when the consideration is due. Okay, so you're only looking at the customer's ability and the intention to pay the consideration when the consideration is due. Okay, now it goes on to say that the amount of the consideration that the entity may be entitled to may be less. So that is where we get into this thing of variable consideration, but that really is something we're going to be discussing later on, because that comes in later in the standard. But the key thing here to understand is that we're looking at whether the customer is able to pay, whether they have the ability to pay that consideration when the consideration is due. Okay, so let's look at some examples from the illustrative examples in the standard that are slightly adapted to illustrate how we apply these steps. Specifically, we're looking at the application of this fifth step over here to see how it filters into real-world application. For our first example, we're going to look at the example of a developer, a real estate developer that is selling a building to a customer. Okay, so we have, let's say this is the entity, so it is a real estate, okay, developer, okay, meaning that this entity is constructing buildings and then selling those buildings to customers. Okay, so this developer enters into a contract with a customer. So over here is the customer to sell a building. So the cost to the real estate developer of this building is 6 million, and the real estate developer is selling it to the customer for 10 million rand. Okay, so this is what the building is being sold for. Now, in terms of the contractual agreement between the customer and the developer, what is going to happen is the customer is paying upfront a non-refundable deposit of, let's say, 500,000. So the customer pays that upfront non-refundable deposit, and the remaining 95%, okay, is essentially paid in installments over a number of years. Okay, now this agreement between the developer and the customer is on a non-recourse basis. So what this means is that if the customer is not able to pay for the building, the developer is able to reclaim the building. Okay, if the customer defaults, the developer can reclaim. However, the customer's liability is limited in that the developer can only get the building back, right? And if the value of the building is not enough to offset the remaining debt, then that's it. The real estate developer essentially bears the loss. Okay, so the question now becomes, and another important fact over here is that at the inception of this contract is when the customer obtains control of the building, right? So the customer has control of the building from inception. Okay, the other thing about this customer is that the reason why this customer wants this building is because this building is actually a restaurant, okay, in a very swanky area. Okay, but this area that the customer is building the restaurant in is quite a competitive area, meaning there are many other restaurants that are operating in that facility. It's quite competitive, right? So this customer is going in there. The business is selling them the restaurant, but they're going into an environment that's quite competitive. So really the question here becomes, is this customer going to be able to repay or is the customer going to be able to pay for this building? Because the customer is obviously thinking, okay, as I run the restaurant, I make profits, I pay, but if it's in question, whether or not the customer will be able to pay because of the level of competition in that area, the business really has to think, the real estate developer really needs to think now, do we meet this criteria, right? Step 5 in the contract steps, okay? Do we meet this probability of the collectability? Do we meet that criteria? Okay, so in assessing whether 9E is met, okay, so that's paragraph 9E in IFRS 15, the real estate developer concludes that the criteria is not met, okay? And the reason why is because the customer is intending to repay from the profits that are generated from the restaurant. However, because of the level of competition, there is considerable doubt, as to whether or not the business is going to be profitable because it's a new restaurant entering into quite a saturated market already. So we have doubts whether they're going to pay. Another thing is that there are no other income or assets that the real estate developer can access from the customer because, of course, this is a non-recourse loan. So there is limited liability from the perspective of the customer. So for these reasons, the conclusion here is that the criteria in 9E are not then satisfied. So what does that mean? It means that the business then is not allowed to recognize revenue from this contract. Okay, so no revenue can be recognized. Oopsie, what is going on here? Okay, so no revenue can be recognized from this contract. Okay, so we know that upfront the customer is paying the 500,000 as an upfront non-refundable deposit. So this deposit cannot be recorded as revenue yet because we haven't satisfied, the criteria, step 1 in our 5 steps for recognizing revenue. So we fail on step 1, so we can't recognize revenue. So instead, we're going to recognize a contract liability. Okay, we're going to recognize this as a contract liability. And this contract liability is only going to be extinguished, or we can only recognize revenue, right? Once substantially all of the remaining consideration has been paid. So there's 95% outstanding. So let's say that most of that 95% has been paid by the customer. Then we can recognize revenue. Or if the contract is terminated, and because this is a non-refundable deposit, the customer, the entity can then recognize it as revenue. Okay, so now let's look at another example. Okay, so in this example, we have an entity, okay, that is selling goods, okay, to the customer, and we have goods that are being sold of 500,000. Now, with regards to this customer over here, okay, here's the customer, again, new customer. This is the first time that this entity is selling goods to this customer. Okay, it's first time. Now, this customer operates in a region that is currently experiencing economic difficulty. But now you might be thinking, but if the region is experiencing economic difficulty, why would the entity want to sell goods to this customer? Because wouldn't we expect that, we're not actually going to get all of our money back? But the entity decides, look, even though the region currently has economic difficulty, we anticipate that in the next 2 to 3 years, it's going to turn around and things are going to swing up, in terms of the there's going to be an economic recovery. And we want to get in now with this customer so that we can start to build a relationship so that when things, when the economy turns, that they've already established a relationship with the customer, established a presence within the region, so they are happy to enter into this contract. And when they look at this 500,000 of goods that they are selling, they're like, okay, if we look at this realistically, what we actually expect is that we expect that the customer is only going to pay us 200,000. Okay? We expect that that is what we would be able to collect. Now, when we are thinking now about paragraph 9E and whether or not we are able to recognize revenue, in this case, we say that the requirements of 9E are actually met. Now, why do we say that the requirements of 9E are met? I'm going to go back to 9E and just read over there the wording. Remember, it says here that in evaluating collectability, okay, an entity shall consider the customer's ability and intention to pay the consideration when it is due, and the consideration to which the entity will be entitled may be less than the stated price in which case the contract has a variable consideration and there is a price concession given to the customer. So because we have this implicit price concession in the contract, right? And this is what we reliably expect to receive from the customer, we are able to recognize revenue in terms of this contract. So revenue then will be recognized. Okay. Now let's look at another example. Okay. So in this example, and this is coming from the third illustrative example, we have a situation where we have a patient that shows up at an emergency room. Okay, so imagine that this is a private hospital. Okay, and a patient shows up to an emergency room, and because of the condition in which the patient was, by law they are obligated to treat the patient to try and save the patient's life. And in treating the patient, after all of the costs are tallied up, it turns out that the cost to save this patient's life was 70,000, right? So this was essentially the debt that is being incurred by the patient. Okay, so this is potentially the revenue that the hospital wants to recognize. Okay, now when we are looking at the revenue recognition for the patient over here, who is in this case the customer. Okay, it's important to understand that at the time that the patient comes in, right, there's no information regarding whether the person has medical aid to pay for this, but afterwards we find out actually this patient doesn't have any medical aid. So it's unlikely that we would be able to recover the full 70,000 from the medical aid. Okay, so then what happens is the hospital then looks at all of the pertinent facts relating to the patient, so the economic abilities, etc., and then they designate this patient into a different customer class. So they have different customer classes, and those customer classes are based on whether or not those customers are going to be able to pay them, right? So let's say they put this patient in a customer class, just make up a class E, I don't know, and then the customers in those class, right, the hospital would have historic information about how well they are able to collect revenue from those customers based on similar background, similar economic situation. And so let's say that the hospital then estimates that it is reasonable, okay, that they could collect 2,000 rand from this customer. Okay, so the question now is, do we satisfy the requirements of 9E? Okay, so can we recognize revenue? Okay, well, For 9E, we're looking at the probability, so the probability of being able to collect. And based on our historic data for this class of customers, we know that we are able to collect this amount. So therefore, 9E is satisfied and we are able to recognize revenue from the customer for this transaction. Okay. Now, the last example I want to look at, okay, relates to an entity that has a patent. Okay, so the entity has a patent, and the entity allows another party to use its patent for a number of years. So then the entity is going to be earning royalty income, okay, over a number of years. Okay, so let's say in year 1, okay, the entity receives all of the royalty income from the customer, so everything goes well. Okay. Now, in year 2, the entity finds out that the customer has some financial difficulties, okay, but the customer still has limited access to a credit line, some other cash facilities, and the customer made full payments in quarter 1 and quarter 2, but in quarters 3 and 4, the customer made nominal payments. So they didn't pay the full amount, but they paid something. Okay. Then, in year 3, at this point, there is no credit access, okay, for the customer because their financial situation has deteriorated this much. Okay, so they have no credit line. Things are really going bad. They are no longer able to pay the entity. Okay, it's unlikely, that they would. So the question is, if we have this contract where we are earning revenue over a number of years, right? Do we satisfy the criteria for 9E? Now, there's a special paragraph that I want to refer to at this point. Okay, so the special paragraph that I want to refer to here is paragraph 13. So in paragraph 13, it says, okay, if a contract with a customer meets the criteria 9 at inception. Now, we know that at inception, everything is fine. We've assessed the customer. They can pay. They have paid. There was no information at the start, so we are happy, right? So we've satisfied 9E at the start. We're happy with that. Okay, so it says if it meets that criteria at 9E, the entity is not going to reassess every year whether 9E is still met. So in the second year, they're not going to reassess, right? Unless there is an indication of a significant change in facts and circumstances. Now, in year 2, even though the entity has financial difficulties, the entity is still making payments. They're making some nominal payments. They still have some access to a credit line. So the requirements here of 9E are still met because there hasn't been a significant change. However, in year 3, there is a significant change in the entity's ability to pay because they have no more access to a credit line and their financial condition has significantly deteriorated. So then at that point, we would reassess whether 9E is still met, and we would conclude that 9E is not met in that situation. So then the entity is no longer able to recognize revenue from year 3 onwards, and any receivable that they have recognized. So let's say they have recognized a receivable for royalties that they are meant to receive. That receivable is going to be impaired in terms of IFRS 9. Okay, so let's tie it all in together. Okay, what have we learned? Okay, we learned that in the first step of revenue recognition, we have to identify the contract with the customer. And in identifying the contract of the customer, there were 5 things that we needed to consider. And the really important one was the 5th one, which was about the probability of being able to collect the consideration. And so we said that when we are looking at that probability, we are looking at the customer's ability and their intention to pay at the start. And once it's met, once that criteria is met at the inception, at the start of the contract, we are able to recognize revenue unless there's a significant change, right, in facts and circumstances relating to the recoverability from the client, and then we would reassess if 9E still is met. And if we conclude that it's not met, then we are no longer able to recognize revenue. Okay, so that was quite a lot to take in. We are just on step 1. So in the next video, I'm going to look at the second step of revenue recognition, which is about identifying performance obligations. And yeah, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.